Kia ora koutou, I'm Nick Tookie, the Department of Conservation's Threatened Species Ambassador, and this is the Doc Sounds of Science podcast. Kia ora, ko Nick Tookie tēnei. He konai I pirangi tēnei e pā ana ki ngā sounds of science. This podcast is an opportunity for us to share some of the work done behind the scenes by Doc's technical experts, scientists, rangers, and the miscellaneous experts in between. Today on the show we have the Dark Knight himself, Colin O'Donnell. Kia ora, Colin.
Kia ora, Nick. Ko Colin O'Donnell tēnei. I'm Colin O'Donnell. I'm a Principal Science Advisor at DOC.
What does that mean? Tell us about that.
Well, at the moment I have responsibilities to oversee our research programs on threatened species and ecosystems. So I get to think about just about every threatened species there is and what sort of work we need to do to solve the problems behind it.
Which is a big job. How many threatened species have we got at the moment?
Well, there's about 8,000 species on the list at the moment. So those are things that we've identified. So there's more out there too.
So this is a job for life then?
It's definitely a job for life.
One of your specialties that you're a little bit famous for in nature nerd circles is bats. It might surprise some New Zealanders, to know that we have these couple of species of bats in New Zealand. Can you tell us a little bit about the different species we have here?
Yeah, it is really surprising. Like, lots of people say, "What? We have bats in New Zealand?" And I say, "Of course we do." And we've got two species which have the kind of inspired names of is the long-tailed bat and the short-tailed bat. They're known as pekapeka to Maori. And they're threatened species, so they used to be much more abundant than they are now. In fact, some of the Maori stories talk about them being around the forest in their thousands and thousands and all over New Zealand. So there's nothing like that now. And most of them are sort of hidden away in really remote forest areas.
And they're not, when we think of bats in New Zealand, I suspect many of us who've, gone and had a holiday on the Gold Coast or in Queensland tend to be thinking of those big fruit bat, flying fox type jobs that hang out of the trees and fly in and out of the city at dusk. They're not like that at all, are they?
No, our bats are kind of really tiny little things. They're just literally the size of your thumb. Although if you see them at sunset, they do look bigger because they're like a huge kite. With a tiny little body stuck in the middle. So they're quite cool things. And
what is special about our bats compared to, say, other bats around the world?
Well, they're our bats, obviously. But, I guess from a kind of scientific, ecological, evolutionary point of view, our short-tailed bats in particular are one of the oldest lineages of bats that are known. So, you can go back 20 or 30 million years with a short-tailed bat that's sort of similar to what we have now. And they're particularly weird for lots of reasons. One is that they run around on the ground to feed a lot of the time. And so they're not spending all their time flying around catching little insects in the sky. They've also got a few other things like they can fold their wings away specially so that they don't get all ripped and torn while they run around on the ground.
Yeah, they kind of tear around on their elbows, don't they? Like
If
and
they
bat
run
had elbows.
Incredibly fast. So, they're really agile on the ground. And they also run up and down the tree trunks and, dig for insects in the sort of limbs and stuff like that.
Why do you think bats have been missing from the, New Zealand kind of general public conservation psyche for so long?
You get bats all over the world, and we all know about bats, and we've all been kind of scarred or indoctrinated by sort of some of the stories about bats. So it's not really a surprise. Although we don't see them around our towns and cities. Like, the first time I saw bats in the real was when I was at a pub in the UK once upon a time, and you have a pint and you see these bats flying around your head, and I thought that was pretty exciting. But so you don't see that here now. They used to be in our cities, but they disappeared, in the late 1800s and early 1900s.
What is it that has made them disappear?
Well, the same old reasons why most of our threatened species are in trouble, really. Firstly, habitat loss. Our bats, when I first started working on them, I thought I'd find this cave down in Fiordland and I'd, be able to study them in the cave and find out what was happening. I found out straight away that they lived in trees, little cavities at the tops of, 20 or 30 metres up a beech tree sort of thing.
You've been kind of keeping an eye out for bats for quite a long time, she says, trying to be polite.
I'm saying I'm old.
I'm saying you're very mature. What was it that kind of sparked your interest? What made you decide that while everybody else was off chasing kakapo and all the K-birds, that you were going to focus on these things nobody had heard much about and didn't know where to find them?
People talked about them a lot in conservation circles because we knew that they were endangered, although kind of nobody knew how to find them or how endangered were they or where were they endangered. So it was kind of like a fascinating mystery, and it's really like partly about challenges too. So how do you find a little bat that's the size of your thumb that's flying around in the pitch darkness in remotest Fjordland? It's kind of like an impossible thing to...
Living 20 to 30 metres up a tree.
Exactly. So there's a challenge side. But, when I got really interested was when we were working down in Fjordland. Graham Elliott, Pete Dilks and I have been working down there for 3 years on how to control stoats. We're doing stoat trapping trials to increase numbers of mohua and parakeets and things. We were just walking along the road in the Eglinton one night. We decided to lie down in the middle of the road because it was really warm. Well, it was quite kind of relaxing. And we were just staring up at the sky, and as the stars were coming out, and we saw these bats just flying up and down the bush edge right above us. And I thought, wow, that's really cool. And it sort of made me realise, well, this might be the place to actually try and catch and study them, because, first find your bats to study is the first step.
Yeah, it must have felt like you were chasing a ghost for a little while there.
Yeah. I think I was really fortunate at the time I came along is that there were all these technological developments that made it easier. So, the radio transmitters that you put on a kakapo weigh, 30 or 40 grams, or I don't know what they weigh, but they're great big things that weigh a lot more than a bat. So the radio transmitters were just getting small enough so that you could put them on a bat. So if you could catch one in the first place, you could put one of these transmitters on and figure out where it goes and what it does and where does it live and what it might be threatened by, really.
And how do you catch them?
We originally used mist nets, which are a sort of a net we use for catching birds, if we want to catch those and put transmitters on it, flying birds. The trouble with bats, our bats, is that they echolocate. So, they have a sonar system like a dolphin or a whale.
Or a submarine.
Or a submarine, yeah. That's another story, actually. We put up these nets at night in the places that we were seeing the bats. And the trouble was that the bats just flew around them, or if there was a hole in the net, they'd fly through them, because one of these mist nets was like a brick wall to them.
Oh, so their echolocation can pick up something as fine as a
really fine net, yeah.
Wow.
But, if you think about it, so, okay, our long-tailed bats can feed on sandflies, which is a good thing, but they can be flying around in the forest at 40 or 50 kilometres an hour in the pitch black and catch something the size of a sandfly. So they've got amazing navigation skills. After that, somebody told me about these things called harp traps, which were invented in the 60s. And they're kind of literally what they suggest. They're just a big frame strung with very fine nylon like a harp.
Yeah.
And you put one of those up on a flyway, and somehow the configuration of the lines confuses the echolocation calls. So the bats can still detect them, and most of the time they go around them. But every now and again one says, what's that strange thing in front of me, and bangs into it, and they just slide down the strings and into this catch bag. And so that's how we catch them now.
Yeah, I have to say that one of I think it's my favourite conservation experience ever was catching bats in the central North Island. And first of all, everybody thought I couldn't do it because you have to be quiet, don't you? You have to be quiet for like ages while you're listening for the clicks of the bat detectors. And then, having these tiny little bats in your hand. And then once we'd kind of extricated the bat from the net and we wanted to catch another bat to put transmitters on, somebody put it in a tiny little calico bag and said to me, here you go, tuck this down your shirt. And I remember sitting under a tree in the dark in the mist with a bat tucked in my cleavage, for lack of a better word, thinking, wow, this beats a kakapo on your shoulder any day.
Well, the thing about bats is that they have this thing called torpor, which means when the weather's cold or there's no food around, they lower their body temperature. And so if it's a cold night and you have them, you've caught them, say, to put a transmitter on, and they get a bit cold, they start to sort of basically go down into this sort of little hibernation mode thing. And you really need to warm them up so that they can fly off again.
When it comes to finding the bats, so I know, we've got radio transmitters, we've got bat detectors. I know a lot of community groups now are using bat detectors. And as the technology has grown, how has that helped us find where bats are around the country?
Enormously, because we have automatic remote bat detector systems, in the remotest parts of New Zealand now. And we can answer questions like, are there bats there, and what species are, and what habitat they're living in. But sort of 25 years ago, it wasn't quite that good. But I didn't know a thing called a bat detector even existed. And I guess, New Zealanders don't know about the bat business really, or at least didn't then. And a German tourist on the Milford Road told me, why haven't you got a bat detector? And I thought, what's a bat detector? It'll save me, looking out in the sky and walking around the dark a lot. So a bat detector is just, it's kind of just a small handheld device. So it converts the high frequency echolocation calls to an audible click. And so you can hear these click, 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 click sounds as a bat flies around you. And that was really inspiring to me, because I walked along the road and I heard all this clicking around me and I couldn't see anything. I thought, wow, there's bats flying around my head at the moment.
So and you don't even know they're there.
You just don't know they're there. You couldn't see them or anything.
Yeah.
And, before that, electronics being what they were, if you had, a truck-sized bat detector, suddenly became a handheld bat detector. So that's good. And cheap, gone from $10,000 to $100 sort of thing. So.
Yeah. And I'm noticing particularly communities now involved in predator-free projects are starting to use trail cameras to detect pests and other wildlife on their trapping kind of programs or their trapping trails at night. But in the last little while on social media, I've seen people starting to pick up what seems to be bats in areas where we probably didn't necessarily think they were before, and more bats around urban environments. Do you think people in urban areas have any idea about the bat populations around them?
I probably, most people wouldn't know. It goes back to most people not even knowing we have bats. So, there's not that many urban areas where you get them, but there are a few. They are on the outskirts of Auckland. They are on the outskirts of Hamilton, for example. Geraldine is another place. The best place to see them is actually Stewart Island at Half Moon Bay. There's 3 or 4 street lights in front of the school, and the bats fly backwards and forwards along there feeding every night. So that's a great place to see them.
It's not all good news though, is it, when it comes to bats? First of all, we should probably talk about the greater short-tailed bat, which is a very recent extinction in our conservation history. What happened there?
Yeah, so the greater short-tailed bat was a much bigger bat that used to be all through New Zealand and really common based on the amount of bones and caves around the country. And people suspect the Kiori rat was responsible for its demise on the mainland. They persisted until the 60s on some islands down off the southern end of Stewart Island, so the Southern Titi Islands.
The Mutton-Bird Islands.
Yeah. And unfortunately, rats got to those islands in about, I think, the early 60s. And so by 1967, the last sighting was seen, and those bats were probably killed, or most of them by predation from rats. So predators are the big modern threat to all the bat species. Rats, stoats, cats, and possums all have a go at catching bats. So, and a lot of when I started working quite a while ago in South Canterbury, we sort of went around asking people for bat records and sightings, and about a quarter of the sightings were people saying, "Oh, my cat brought in a bat last night or some other time." So, yeah.
And that's just in your work history, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and not to mention, a pretty recent extinction within the last 50 years.
Yeah.
Let's talk about cats, because the infamous bat cat story was the one near Oakuni, wasn't it, or Ruapehu, where one cat, I remember at the time, the ranger kept finding little ripped up bits of bat wings beneath a bat colony.
That's right, yeah. So that was on the side of Ruapehu. It was a very long way into the bush, so many kilometres into the bush and at high altitude, where there's this known big old red beech tree with which used to have thousands of bats in it. And they figured out in the end a cat was just sitting there catching them as they're coming and going and eating some of them, but leaving others just killed them or played with them and stuff.
Yeah.
In the end they caught it, and after that they know it had killed at least 110 bats, but those are the ones they picked up, the remnants of the wings for. So yeah, so that's just one individual predator having a huge impact on a bat colony.
In 1 week.
In 1 week, yeah.
Yeah. We tend, feral cats fly a bit under the radar, don't they, in terms of predators in the New Zealand environment. We don't like to talk about cats because we don't want to upset people who've got pet cats.
Yeah.
But a feral cat is out there kind of taking out nature like that, all away from, all at night, under the cover of darkness, is something we probably do need to talk about a little bit.
Well, we do, yeah. I mean, these feral cats are definitely a threat, not just to bats, but to a very wide range of wildlife, really. So from some of our threatened invertebrates and birds as well, and lizards, like the major predators of our lizards. So
yeah. I used to work in Otago with some of those giant skinks, and we saw the impact they were having there. And I guess the last thing I would say to round that off is feral cats don't have a very nice life. The ones that I experienced earlier in my career were all starving, diseased, fighting. It's not a moggy cuddled up by the fire.
No. These are quite different animals, really.
Yeah, no way to live, really. If we go back to the bats, people have all kinds of wacky ideas about bats, and maybe Dracula's got a bit to answer for. But it's a common misconception that bats hibernate over winter. Can you explain? We touched on it before, but can you explain what's actually happening to the bat when in those cooler temperatures?
Yeah, so I mean, I don't think any animals really hibernate the way that we kind of anecdotally think about it. Like at the beginning of the winter, you go to sleep, and then at the end of the winter, you wake up, and that was it. So the bats, they use a thing that's called torpor, and that's where they can lower their body temperature right down to just above freezing. And like when they're in deep torpor, they will take one breath every 5 minutes or so.
Wow.
And that's a way to conserve their body fat through times when there's not much food around. But it's very much temperature dependent. So they can do it in the middle of summer if you have a really cold night, or in southern New Zealand, say you might have a late snowfall at the end of November or something and have a cold week. They'll all go into this torpor mode then. Same way as during the winter, if it suddenly warms up and insects are flying around, they'll all wake up again and start flying around and look for food. But of course in winter, on average, it's much, much cooler. So they tend to sleep most of the winter. But
bit like a scarfie in Dunedin.
Yeah, probably. Yeah. Hey, I went to Otago. Anyway, they might, if they go to sleep into this torpor mode, like once every sort of 10 days to 2 weeks, they will wake up. They'll probably stick their noses out into the environment and say, is it still cold? If it's still cold, they just go back to sleep for another 2 weeks. And then, so I guess in the autumn, they start putting on a lot of fat, and a little thumb-sized bat will suddenly look like two thumbs, those little rotund things. And that fat's meant to get them through the winter until the following spring, if there's no food.
So obviously the New Zealand bats have a real sensitivity to the temperature around them. And one of the things that I know we're all becoming increasingly concerned about within the department is impacts of climate change on threatened species.
Yeah.
What does climate change mean for a species as ancient as the New Zealand bats, for example?
There's sort of various scenarios, actually. Some could be good and some could be bad. And so if you end up with warmer winters, and there might be more food around, and maybe that's good for them. Or you have an early breeding season or a longer breeding season so that the young, have plenty of time to get raised. So that's on one side of the equation, but the other side is a bit more disturbing because by the same token, if you get woken up more often in winter but there's not enough food around, then you'll run out of fat before spring comes, and that could increase mortality. And we've already actually seen a bit of a signal in that in our overwinter survival sort of studies.
Really?
So that's kind of scary. But I guess the scariest thing is an indirect thing, and that's about having more predators around, because with warmer winters that we are experiencing, and we have measured those, we end up with beech trees seeding and flowering and seeding more heavily, and therefore having more frequent predator plagues. But more importantly, the overwinter survival of the rats might also increase. So with our predator control operations, we rely on knocking them down in the summer, and then the winter knocking them down further, so that by the following spring there are very few rats left in the forest, for example. But as things are getting warmer, the rats aren't dying, in the really cold conditions, and therefore they enter the following spring ready to breed in much higher numbers. And that, of course, is a problem for bats and many other threatened species.
Yeah, that's right. And you hear anecdotal reports around the country just through community groups this year alone in terms of the number of rats people are seeing through winter.
Yeah.
Some of that will be a little bit observer bias because a lot more people are tuned in to
and talking about it. So
talking about it.
Them,
but some of it is probably true.
Well, certainly. We've been measuring it in Fiordland, and every year, on average, winter temperatures are warmer for the last 25 years, in the time that I've been measuring it, and the rat numbers are sort of increasing steadily in the wake of that. So.
And if you've got a colony of torpid bats tucked in for the winter, then it's basically like a fast food joint for rats, isn't it?
Exactly. If you're sound asleep, to raise your temperature out of torpor might, on a good day, take 15 minutes or half an hour. All a rat or a stoat has to do is go in a cavity, find some deeply sleeping bats, and it's like opening the fridge at home. So food for ages.
That is terrifying. Can you tell me a little bit about the kind of predator control work in the project and the benefits in terms of the Eglinton Valley over time?
Yeah, sure. So as I said earlier, I've been doing it for 25 years. The first...
You must have started when you were 12, Colin.
Oh, I must have, yeah. 8, I think I was. Yeah. But so the first years, probably the first good 10 years, was spent figuring out what the problem was. So, first we had to work out how to find the bats and then study them, and then it took a very long time. It's like piecing together a jigsaw in slow motion, finding out little bits of information as you go. But the result of that is that we were monitoring the bats, and each year the numbers were getting lower, and they had these big drops in numbers which coincided with the predator plagues that followed beech masting. And that's we know that for other birds and wildlife as well. And so once we'd gathered that information, which probably took about 10 years, we could then start to saying, hey, this is a problem. We need to try and reverse this decline, because the long-tailed bats down there, they're classified now as critically endangered. They were declining at a rate of about 5% a year.
Wow.
It was quite dramatic. And so, after 150 years of predation, they're just sort of reaching the bottom of that curve where they're starting to head towards extinction. So definitely had to do something about it. And that's when we started to do predator control experiments and then monitor the response. And I guess now I went from a phase of being quite glum and depressed about, the future of bats, but we've been doing predator control for the last 15 years, and the numbers have been steadily increasing since then, so that's really exciting. The short-tailed bats down there, we found those in 1997. We thought there was probably about 300 to 400 there then, and over the last 15 years, the numbers have increased to well over 3,000. We actually don't know how many there are now, but a couple of summers ago, the team out of Aotearoa counted them coming out of one tree with infrared video cameras, and they counted over 3,000. So that's incredibly exciting. And the long-tailed bats, they live in much smaller colonies spread through the environment, so they're a bit harder to follow. But the 3 study colonies we have down there have increased in size by about 5-fold as well. So one of the colonies, which is at Walker Creek in the Eglinton Valley, the one that I've been studying the longest, that went down to just 24 breeding females in about 2000, following several of these rat plagues. And then last season it was up to about 120 breeding females. So that's really exciting stuff from my perspective.
That must make you feel very good about getting out of bed and coming to work every day when you can see results like that.
Yeah. The message though is that it's all long-term work. You don't see it overnight. But I guess also keep faith and keep working it. Keep trying new ways to control things and keep at it over time, and you'll see some really good rewards. Well
done. I have a question for you that is completely unrelated to any of this and relates to tequila. Can you please explain to us what bats have to do with tequila?
Well, all the tequila drinkers out there have got bats to thank, because tequila comes from this plant, blue agave, and the only pollinators of blue agave in the world, the natural pollinators, are bats. So if we didn't have bats, there'd be no blue agave. And that's the case with, a lot of bats pollinate flowers and disperse seeds. And so, I read a study a few years ago where cocoa production was increased by 20% by bat pollination. Bananas, you didn't ask me about bananas. So again, the natural pollinators of bananas are bats. And these days, all the bananas that we see come from clones and things like that. But if a disease took out all those bananas overnight in the world, then we'd need the bats to bring them back, really.
It's such a great point you raise, and it's something I'm tucking away in my brain to explain to my neighbour who loves tequila. Can't wait to tell him that story. But that bit about nature's contribution to people or ecosystem services, we so often forget that, don't we? And earlier this year, I read one of the international reports that said 75% of all our commercial crops, so all the food we eat, is pollinated by animals.
Yeah.
And so the minute we lose those, we're basically starving ourselves, right?
That's right, yeah. And a lot of plants only flower at night, so that, the plants know that there's these bats out there. And that's the thing at bananas and the tequila flowers, opening at night with really nice nectar in them to attract the bats into them. So.
And in New Zealand, of course, we've got our very special flower of Hades, or dactylanthus.
Oh, is that what you call it? I thought it was called the wood rose. But
it is called the wood rose, which needs the bats just as much as they need it, right?
That's right. It's a parasitic flower that comes out of the ground. It sort of lives on tree roots.
It's a zombie flower.
Is it?
Well, it sounds like one.
And, again, the bats are the natural pollinator because it has this incredibly rich nectar, and they just sort of wolf it down and, of course, pollinate the flowers. And then they move to the next flowers and pollinate those. But there's other plants in New Zealand that do similar things. Just a tree like koikoi has its flowers come out of the tree trunk in the inflorescence, so it's hanging out in the open. And that's an adaptation to bat pollination. So there's, it's not just the dactylanthus.
That's really interesting to hear. I want to talk a little bit about, as we're seeing more bats around us and as we start to kind of cross boundaries with bats in New Zealand, one of the most terrifying facts I've heard recently is to do with what happens when bats interact with wind farms. So wind farms are great, right? Everybody wants a wind farm because we want
sustainable
clean
energy. Yeah.
So what is the problem for bats when it comes to wind farms?
Yeah, unfortunately, globally, there's obviously lots of wind farms, and people have been identifying for quite some time lots of dead bats under wind turbines. And it is a global problem that turbines can kill bats. And for a long time, people thought, well, the blades are, striking the bats and killing them. But it turns out to be a much more interesting and complex story than that. What happens with wind turbines is that they heat the air, and insects like warmth, and so they get attracted to them, and the bats get attracted to them and feed around the blades. And there's a Canadian study where they use thermal imagery where you can see the bats actually flying around the curve of the blade catching insects.
In the warm kind of microclimate.
Yeah. And so, again, the bats have amazing, skill, I suppose, with their echolocation. And they know the turbine blade's there and they can fly around it, even, however fast the blade is sweeping down. But the problem is that the blade at certain wind speeds creates a change in barometric pressure. And if the bat's flying around the blade at that time, pop, it explodes on the inside from the change in pressure. And it's not funny for the bat.
No, it's not funny. It just sounds outrageous. Yeah. Is it like when you dive too deep and you get the bends and you explode? I don't know about that, but it's called. It's called barotrauma, and it'll be something like that. So, what people are starting to do though is figure out are there bats at my wind farm, and then curtail the activity of the turbines at the times the bats are there. And overseas, especially in Germany, they're starting to put bat detectors actually in the turbines themselves, and they figure out the conditions when bats are most likely to be there. And they basically program the turbines to switch off when the bats are around. So it's actually not an insurmountable problem. It's a problem that certainly in New Zealand we really haven't thought about until recently. And hopefully we'll end up with lots more wind farms in New Zealand in the future. But we need to firstly place them in places where there aren't bats. And there's a hell of a lot of New Zealand that doesn't have bats in it. So, think about putting your wind farm in the right place. And then if it is a batty place, then figure out ways of identifying when the bats are there and, turning the turbines off for that period of time. You've been able to track bats all over the world. And in fact, Colin and I share an office, and this is a constant source of contention for me because Colin goes to all the places I want to go to in the world, including you've been to Mexico, you recently got back from Madagascar. What's been one of your strangest moments tracking bats in the field?
There was another time on that trip where we'd been trapping in the rainforest at night, and we went to check our traps. And when we were walking back along the trap, there were fresh tiger prints in the mud along the track that we'd just come along.
Wow.
And so that was kind of a bit scary sounding, seeming.
Well, that would be enough for me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Another time we were working in Mexico in the caves, and there's lots of different bats in those caves, and we were sort of crawling through these spaces, and all of a sudden I put my knee in this red jelly, I think it was. It looked like a big jelly on a thing, and it was a bit gross. But then I sort of looked up above me, and above me were 6 vampire bats. And of course, this jelly was their excretion from eating blood. But they were quite amazing-looking bats. They were looking at you, really intelligently and following you around and stuff. So that's kind of creepy. But vampire bats are only 2 species that drink blood out of 1,300 species in the whole world. So
still a little bit terrifying.
Yeah.
A little bit. I was making a little bit throwing up in my mouth faces then. I think that would be enough bat hunting for me if I saw that. So vampire bats are probably the reason that people get the heebie-jeebies around bats.
Yeah.
And it's created a bit of a PR problem, right?
We take out people in Fiordland every year, and we usually have about 50 people come out over a couple of nights to see the bats in the Eglinton Valley. And I'd swear that at least a third or a half are a bit, sort of nervous about it. They just think, I'm intrigued because of the vampire thing and all that. I'm really intrigued. I'm going to go along, but I don't know if I'm going to look too closely. I'm definitely not going to touch them. Anyway, we go out and we put some traps up as part of our normal routine work. And I'd swear that, 99.99% of people just love the bats once they see them. There's been so many times when people have looked in the bat trap and say, but where's the bat? And because I'm thinking of, there's this huge, ginormous, monstrous thing in this trap, but they just see these little brown, cute, fluffy things running around in them. And again, once you put a long-tailed bat in your hand, you'll be in love with them forever.
I entirely agree. I think, we're a bit short on supply of small, cute, furry things that belong in New Zealand. And having had a short-tailed bat in my hand, in fact, which then ran up and perched on my head, that was it. Bats were my totem. What is something that you wish more people knew about your work, Colin?
I mean, I think the first thing is I'd like to take everyone in New Zealand to see a bat, because then they'll be sold. Most people would be. And yeah, just to see how nice they are. I'd like people to understand, the role they play in our ecosystem. So we talked about pollination before, but they're also a natural insecticide. So they can control insects. I mean, they love sandflies, they love mosquitoes, but they also love a couple of their favourite things are grass grub beetles and piranha moths, which are big agricultural pests in New Zealand. So if we could bring, the bats back to our agricultural landscapes, then they'll be doing us quite the service.
They'd be the farmer's best friend.
So, yeah.
Beautiful. On that note then, what is it that we could each do? What could New Zealanders listening to this out there do to help contribute to the survival and the thriving of bats in our landscape?
Well, I guess there's a bunch of things that people could do. I mean, one is about awareness and just understanding what we're trying to achieve and to support the work that gets done in the big forest tracts with the predator control and so on. But of course, in the places where you have bats closer to people or in small reserves, then, doing the local trapping in your place is a really good thing to do. People have been experimenting a bit with artificial bat houses, so we have lost all the cavities in the trees to try and put up artificial houses to attract them. Now that's sort of more a research question at the moment, because we don't know what sort of house to build to attract them and so on. But, these are experiments that people can do, almost in their backyards. So.
Colin, I could listen to you for days and days and days about bats, and that's only a fraction of the threatened species work that you do for DOC. I just really want to thank you for coming in and sharing all your cool stories. I'm definitely taking the tequila one away. Thanks, Colin.
Cool. Kia ora, Nick.